Privileged, of course, today because we're going to talk about the Great Lakes region, and we have two of our papers that are specifically about Rwanda, and a paper about a country very important to Rwanda, since, of course, the Rwandan Patriotic Front originally were founded in Uganda. So we're right where we want to be. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and of course Charles has done this so many times that he can just run the thing. I'll just be counting minutes over there. But at the end of the panel, usually after we have time for everybody to discuss and certainly ask questions, I'll try to usually provide a brief summary of some of the best insights, hopefully, that we've gotten from today. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn to Charles.
Unfortunately, due to where I'm working, I need to start this out with a couple disclaimers. Anything I say you can't talk about, no, I'm messing with you. But on the other hand, simply put, any opinions that we present today in this panel are ours and ours alone. They do not represent the official position either of the United States Army, the Department of Defense, or the federal government. Having said that, we can get going, at least on my personal portion of it. This paper itself has an interesting genesis. I've been working on a project involving the Kagera War for several years now. It's been very hard to get information on it. As such, this was more my attempt to come to grips with the limited amount that we can get actually on the Ugandan contributions to this. As to what is the Kagera War, I won't spoil it for you. It'll come up in the paper. And once I saw the actual theme of the conference of diaspora, of exile, of movement of populations, this seemed very appropriate, as there's a very, very huge amount of Ugandan exiles that actually are forced out of the country in the 1970s. And it also would form one of the very good bookends for our chronologically arranged panel. And so having said that, I'm going to go ahead and get going, because I'm certain I've already burned far too much time. Having said that, on June 3rd of 1979, the Tanzanian People's Defense Force, Special Task Force, very wordy, slowly halted a few hundred yards from the Sudanese border. Its officers stared into Sudanese territory at the remnants of Ugandan military units that had supported the reign of Idi Amin, but now had fled across international boundaries to avoid falling with the rest of his regime. This small scene marked the unofficial conclusion of what is known to the Tanzanians as the Kagera War, which had begun at the end of October of the previous year. However, while the Kagera War is rightfully understood as a Tanzanian victory over the tyrannical forces of Idi Amin, a small but significant part of the war was played by the communities of Ugandan exiles. Organized around older statesmen and young nationalists, the Ugandan exiles eventually banded together into what was called the Ugandan National Liberation Front, which formed a key part in the history of the Kagera War itself, providing military support, critical intelligence, and a political foundation for the successful conclusion of the war. Now, of course, the foundations of all of this go back to the 1960s. The vast majority of exiled Ugandans that took part in the Kagera War can trace their origins to the seizure of power by General Idi Amin in 1971. Amin had risen to prominence in the post-colonial military, having been commissioned as an officer in the wave of Africanization that marked the late British colonial military of Uganda. He was not considered an intelligent or educated candidate, but instead was one of the long-service non-commissioned officers, of the type the British preferred. He was from the Kakwa ethnic group of northern Uganda, which they considered a martial race. I can go more into length at that later, but I need to move on from here. And had a flair for athletics and discipline that impressed the colonial officer corps. As Uganda became independent, Amin served in the army of President Milton Obote, another northerner who had been elected in 1962. Amin's name became well known following Obote's clashes with the Kabaka of the Baganda in 1966, and with the Baganda rallying around their Kabaka and Obote worrying about possible violence in Kampala, he dispatched Amin to deal with their disturbances. Amin responded by assaulting the Kabaka's residents, driving the Kabaka into exile and killing over 200 Baganda that were trying to defend him. However, despite the prominence this accorded Amin, it did Obote little good, as he continued clashing with the various power blocks of Uganda in the 5 traditional kingdoms, different ethnic groups. And And he and his Uganda's People's Conference, the UPC, his political party, became increasingly unpopular despite the essential absolute power that he managed to ensconce himself in. By 1969-1970, Obote tried one last throw of the dice, propagating what he called the common man's charter as part of a calculated move to the left. This brought him little support within Uganda, and unfortunately, extremely alarmed Cold War allies Britain and Israel. They saw it very much as creeping communism. When Obote was in Singapore in a Commonwealth conference in January of 1971, Amin seized power in a coup that was seen as generally welcomed initially. And of course, while initially Amin projected the veneer of a populist and popular leader, he quickly gained a reputation for authoritarian brutality. Within a few short months, his supporters had essentially cleansed the militaries of Southerners and Acholi being Milton Obote's group, jailed several opposition figures, and begun assembling a terrifying security apparatus that would oversee a reign of terror that would last 8 years. Senior politicians within the military and government were senior positions within the military and government were quickly filled by Amin with members of his Kakwa ethnic group or numerous Nubian minority groups from the north of Uganda. And despite this aggressive seizure of power and the heavy-handed dismissal of previous authorities, it did not take long for political allies of Obote, or even simply those intellectuals and soldiers that Amin saw as threats to begin fleeing Uganda for the safer confines of Kenya, Zambia, or the Sudan. These individuals joined the already diasporic Ugandans living in these locations as laborers, students, and academics. However, even as Amin entrenched himself, these groups began to organize and discuss the possibility of overthrowing the new military dictator of Uganda. Am I speaking too quickly? I tend to have that thing. In terms of the groups themselves, as explanation, that would be Milton Obote, and the gentleman with the massive amount of flair is Idi Amin. The exile groups themselves. The exiled opposition to Amin represented a broad swath of Ugandan citizenry. Due to his autocratic rule and increasingly violent methods, any political or military figure that did not fit within Amin's rule was a candidate for the opposition. Figures from monarchist and conservative parties found themselves in the company of student activists and leftist revolutionaries. Some of these groups would later coalesce. Some of these groups, which would later coalesce, would never grow to more than a few dozen members in token representation. Initially, this paper will deal just 3 primary groups involved in this resistance. That would be Milton Obote's group, which will later take on the name Kikosi Maalum, the Save Uganda movement, and Yoweri Museveni's group, which would later be called the Front for National Salvation, or FRONASA. These 3 gentlemen here are Taito Okello, David Oyite Ojak, and oh goodness, I believe one of the other Okellos. They're working with Milton Obote at the time, and then this would be Yoweri Museveni in his Bush War days. Obote, despite his unpopularity at the time of his exile, remained the highest profile of any of these individuals and attracted significant support to begin with. Beyond this, he was seen by Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, where he had fled to, as the last legitimate ruler of Uganda, and had been given refuge and aid by Tanzania since the moment of his fall. In fact, when he's flying back from the Commonwealth Conference, he flies to Dar es Salaam and is given a via there to try to coordinate his next couple moves. As such, he was able to live in relative comfort and travel significantly to rebuild what's seen as somewhat of a government in exile. In doing so, he not only attracted a significant amount of former Ugandan People's Congress functionaries, but also several high-profile military men. Colonel Taito Okello, an ethnic Acholi officer that had served in the Ugandan armed forces since the Second World War, managed to escape Uganda and form the foundation of a resurgent military under Obote. He was aided by David Oyite Ojak, a former a junior officer of Acholi descent who had fled Uganda for much the same reason as he. Now you'll notice a theme here already, that these are all Acholi. This will be very significant in the post-war years. With a relatively stable power base, a claim to legitimacy, professional military officers, and the support of Tanzania, Obote did his best to establish himself as the center of exile activities, despite his still significant unpopularity among other groups. The Save Uganda movement, the SUM, was a much smaller and quieter organization than Obote. It was very high profile at the time. It was founded later than most of the other movements, having been created in 1973. That'll be in the wake of an operation that I'll discuss shortly. Having been created by Ugandan exiles in Nairobi and later forming also in Tanzania. Instead of vying for a political influence or legitimacy as Obote does, the SUM claimed no ideology or political goal aside from the toppling of Amin. To this end, the Quiet Group undertook dozens of small-scale missions into Uganda to try to suborn military units or set up guerrilla cells. They undertook general guerrilla training. They never really amounted to a whole lot, but they actually killed quite a few people, which I guess is amounting to a small degree, but they're never able to affect what they're really looking for. And then finally, the largest of the larger militarized groups, there's Yoweri Museveni's Fronasa. Museveni had been a student at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 1960s, where as a student he had embraced Marxism and joined the university students' African Revolutionary Front. While still there, he went to Mozambique in '68, where he was trained as a guerrilla in tactics and strategy by Frelimo and gained an appreciation for clandestine revolutionary warfare. Initially working with Obote, he disagreed with him about the methods of opposing Amin. He tried consistently to train his own cadres and build his own forces from those he had earlier trained with and retained an affinity with. However, his political opposition to Obote meant he rarely gained the initial trust or notice that Obote had. Despite his small following, he had been given arms and space to train in Tanzania by Nyeri's government, and he used this base of operations to lead several small forays into Uganda to try to set up guerrilla cells. They all failed. They all were caught within several days of being set up and were generally brutally killed by Amin's security forces. But the thing is by 1970, and by the 1970s, specifically 71, Obote has built this critical mass of troops. Museveni's trying to gain some influence. And at this point, Obote says, we've got enough. Amin is still very weak. This is the time to take Uganda back. And he gets Nyeri to actually agree with him. And in 1972, there would be Nyeri, obviously. And for those of you that have not noticed him, that would be Mwalimu Nyerere, the president of Tanzania at the time. He gets Nyeri to agree with him, and Nyeri allows an invasion, a conventional invasion of Uganda from Tanzania. As you'll notice, there's actually the shared border right there, along there. This goes terribly wrong. They try a three-pronged assault. They have an air assault with the DC-9 that actually crashes at Kilimanjaro Airport, never makes it there. They try a two-column approach, assuming that if they go to Mbarara and Masaka, they will be able to gain momentum as they go and eventually take Kampala. The column that hits Mbarara has Museveni in it. He says, this is my base of operations. This is where I'll find all kinds of support. It doesn't materialize. They get turned back at Mbarara by Amin's security forces with heavy casualties. Only 46 out of the initial 300 fighters make it back. They send 1,000 towards Masaka, and they run straight into a prepared Ugandan column that basically kills everyone but about 100 that make it back. Kills or captures, but any that are captured are eventually killed. This is a crushing loss. Everything they said would work didn't. Nyeri begins losing faith, and beyond that, this causes a gigantic disturbance in the political sphere in East Africa and in Africa in general. The Organization of African Unity at this point is founded on the idea that sovereign states are exactly that, sovereign. You're not allowed to interfere in the internal workings of them, and you're certainly not allowed to invade other countries. This Nyeri takes an extraordinary beating in the press, in the Pan-African political scene. He's seen as someone that is to a degree no longer trustworthy. Part of this is due to his support of Biafra, and this is seen as a way to kind of get back at him, but part of it also is a very disturbed group that are wondering if Nyeri is willing to allow exiles to invade from his country, why just Uganda? And he's forced to sign what's called the 1972 Mogadishu Agreement, where he disavows any exile activities. He makes the exiles persona non grata within his country, shuts down all activities within his borders, or at least claims to, and actually recognizes the regime of Idi Amin. And in theory, this would be the end of the exile movement. But behind the scenes, his military officers and members of his political apparatus, Nyeri's, talk with the exiles and essentially say, listen, we just can't talk about what you're doing. You have to be quiet, and we're going to have to move some of you around. He specifically then, this is when Museveni formally breaks with Obote. He says, this was your idea, this was your fault, everything went wrong. If we had done it my way, it would have worked. And he's very strident about that in his autobiography, as you would imagine. Obote continues quietly organizing, but basically vanishes from the political scene. But for these first couple of years in the 1970s, they can't be loud about it. And it seems like the dream has actually died. Museveni actually takes a job at a small technical college teaching, although he does continue organizing a group led by his younger brother, General Salim Saleh, who trains in Mozambique. Obote begins putting his entire group together, but they hit 75, 76, 77, and no activities have been undertaken. Amin seems more ensconced than ever, and it seems they'll never go home. But in 1978, Amin makes a terrible mistake. Well, he may not have really had too much of a choice. At this point, his army is fracturing between himself and General Muhammad Idrisi, and he's losing power. And he needs to do something with his military. He needs to keep them active. And he invades what's called the Kagera salient. It basically stretches this river, this area here, and he claims it for Uganda. He says, traditionally, this should belong to us. This is ours. Nyeri takes this opportunity and says, this is wonderful. He's abrogated the agreement. I don't need to deal with this man as if he's a head of state anymore. He immediately recalls as many of the guerrillas as possible, as many of the Ugandan exiles as possible. He moves his military forces, and he actually very quickly, even without the help of the Ugandan exiles, throws the Amin forces out of his territory. But now he has a question, and a very difficult question, because the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, has not said anything. They have not chastised Amin for invading his neighbor. They haven't taken any action. And now it's the question of, do we keep Amin and keep going through this cycle, or do we get rid of him? And if we get rid of him, how do we make it palatable to the greater African community? And this is where the exiles come in. He grabs Obote's group, which at this point is calling itself Kikosa Malum, at least the military section. He grabs Museveni's troops and says, you're going to be the vanguard. You're going to lead the way into Uganda. And if anyone asks, it's only you guys in Uganda. He sends them back along the same axes of the earlier invasion. And so Okello and Obote go towards Masaka. Museveni head towards Mbarara. And this time, people are finally sick and tired of Amin. Museveni managed to gather about 9,000 followers in about 2 weeks around Mbarara. The Okello and Obote groups, not quite as successful, but at this point they're backed by about 45,000 Tanzanian troops that, if anyone asked, were Ugandan. And they begin a drive forward and forward and forward, and when they're about to take Kampala in 1979, they suddenly realize, oh my goodness, this war is going to end. This war is going to end, and we have no idea what's going to happen after. And so they organize what's called the Moshi Conference, the Moshi Unity Conference, where they grab every exile group leader they can find, whether they represent only a small dozen Ugandan exiles or the larger groups, and come together and say, we need to create a government. We need to figure out how this is going to work. But there's one major change. The 1972 failure had so left a stench on Obote, and he was seen as trying to manipulate this process so much that Nyeri tells him, you're not coming to this conference. You will not be here, and keeps him away. This actually is fairly welcomed by some groups. Others are very upset about it. There are many that still are that still do feel that Obote is the legitimate leader of the Ugandan exiles. This is just a small amount of, there's about 10 pages of just all the representatives that were there. It takes them days and days of contentious politics, and they finally reach a compromise where there will be an executive committee, which is led by Yusufu Lule, who is a former professor from Makerere University, will lead the new government as the head of the executive council, and General Taito Okello will be in charge of the military, with Museveni serving underneath him. With this, finally, the Moshi Unity Conference creates the new legitimate Ugandan government. And when they finally topple Idi Amin, this is the group that the Tanzanians swear in, that they get one of the justices of the Ugandan Supreme Court to swear in on the Kampala courthouse steps. And with the final sweeping away of the remnants of Idi Amin's forces, with Idi Amin himself going into exile, first to Sudan, then finally in Saudi Arabia, Libya, then Saudi Arabia. This is it. The exiles now are the government. They not only give political legitimacy to the invasion, saying, look, it's Ugandans taking their country back, it's not Tanzanians invading. They actually now form this new government. This is the dawning of a new age for Uganda. These exiles have created a new basis for the state, a new constitutional basis after Amin. This is, for many people, a touchstone moment. And this is the triumph of the exiles. This is it. This is the moment that they have won. And unfortunately, in the finest Shakespearean tradition, it can't last. I'm giving a quick coda to lead into Cadet Dugas's paper. Lule becomes immediately unpopular among the exile groups. What has united them is getting rid of Amin. Now that Amin's gone, the question is, who really does deserve? Didn't we rush this process? Did we ever really decide among exiles who should be running this country? Lule is tossed out, and Godfrey Banaisa comes in, is running the country for a very, very short amount of time until General Tito Okello turns around and says, Banaisa is no good. Banaisa is no good, and overthrows him in a military coup. This is even beforehand in the 1980 election. Museveni says this is a rigged election, it's terrible, Obote should not be allowed back. Obote actually wins the election, and what many people say, in fact Museveni specifically says is rigged to high heaven, and he retreats to the bush to begin a war. And so, having gone from a very unified, or at least slightly fragmented exile community that's unified around the idea of getting rid of Idi Amin, we end up with, unfortunately, a complete fracture again. And with this, I'll leave my narrative to Cadet Dugas. Thank you.
Between the time of independence and the current presidency of Yoweri Museveni, Uganda saw three vastly different yet fundamentally unstable governments. This period of power struggle occurred between Milton Obote, Idi Amin, and Yoweri Museveni. With my research, I aim to identify the role which the Rwandan Tutsi diaspora to Uganda played during this period. I contend that the Rwandan Tutsi were a decisive force in the political discord in this era. In order to understand the reason behind the Tutsi diaspora to Uganda, it is essential to look at the relationship between the Hutu and Tutsi leading to the conflicts beginning in 1959. The Rwandan population at the time of the 1959 census was 84% Hutu and 14% Tutsi. The majority of the Tutsi were cattle farmers, but a small percent made up the royal family aristocrats who facilitated a feudal caste system in Rwanda. The feudal caste system placed the Hutu as the clients who gave their labor to the Tutsi patrons in return for cattle and security. This system lasted until 1954, when King Mutara Rudahigwa, probably butchered that, I apologize, banned the client-patron relationship. This caste system oppressed the Hutu, and to this day, the Hutu use their memories of oppression as a justification of their disdain for the Tutsi. The caste system caused a degree of a divide between the Hutu and Tutsi, but the most significant factor was the Belgian presence in Rwanda after World War I. For the Belgians to effectively govern Rwanda without significant resistance, they felt it necessary to seek out a partner from the native people. In order for the Belgians to successfully maintain the divide, they classified people based on the number of cattle they owned, and made everyone carry identification cards which expressed whether they were Hutu or Tutsi. Being Tutsi was less of an ethnic class and more of a social classification based on wealth and status, since at this point there had been generations of intermarriage between the Hutu and Tutsi. The Belgians felt threatened by the Pan-Africanist movements of the 1950s, such as those led by Nkrumah of Ghana. They suspected the Tutsi to be more leftist and anti-colonial due to their education levels, and decided to switch their support to that of the Hutu against the Tutsi in 1956 to 1957. In 1961, Le Parti du Mouvement de l'Émancipation Hutu, more commonly referred to as Parmehutu, seized control, ending the Tutsi monarchy by declaring Rwanda a republic. It is important to understand that the divide between the Hutu and Tutsi does not necessarily stem from ancient ethnic hatreds, as many people assume, but is rather a product of the colonial power demanding that everyone have a specific ethnic identity to determine their place in society. From 1961 to 1964, the Hutu killed approximately 10,000 Tutsi and forced roughly 150,000 to seek refuge. By 1980, over 400,000 Tutsi were in the DRC, Uganda, and Tanzania. From here, we will focus on the Tutsi diaspora to Uganda and the Rwandans' role in Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army. In Uganda, there is an ethnic group called the Banyarwanda, literally meaning those who come from Rwanda, in the south and in the west. About half are descendants of migrants who came to Uganda between 1920 and 1960, and about 1/3 is truly Ugandan, and less than 15% are refugees migrating to Uganda since 1959. To this day, Banyarwanda of Rwandan origin face discrimination, hardship, and a feeling of overall non-belonging. The refugees struggled to find an identity due to the Ugandan mindset that Rwandan repatriation was inevitable. Rwandans were not allowed into the secondary school system, issued passports, or granted citizenship. One Ugandan national said, quote, "Even entering into the army could not erase that non-belonging, the makeshift existence where they always knew one day they will have to leave." End quote. The feeling of non-belonging was increased by the oppression of the Banyarwanda by the regimes of Milton Obote and Idi Amin. Milton Obote was the Prime Minister of Uganda from the time of independence until he seized power in 1967 and declared himself president. In 1969, he demanded the exile of all non-skilled foreigners from employment, which definitely negatively affected thousands of Banyarwanda. Due to Obote's strong ties to the Protestant Church, he opposed all that were of different religious views, specifically the Catholic Banyarwanda of Ankole. Obote's oppression of the Banyarwanda led to the group's disdain for his leadership and eagerness to aid in his removal from office. In 1971, Obote was deposed by Idi Amin, the chief of staff of Obote's army. Idi Amin orchestrated the most brutal regime in Uganda's history. Amin became known as, quote, "the butcher of Uganda," end quote, for his brutality against Acholi and Longo ethnic groups, journalists, lawyers, homosexuals, amongst others. Amin's harsh leadership led to the development of the relationship between Yoweri Museveni, Milton Obote, and President of Tanzania, President Nyerere. In 1971, Museveni came into contact with Nyerere, seeking the president's aid in opposition of Amin. Nyerere promised to help under the condition that Museveni and all opposition groups work as one under Milton Obote. Due to immense differences in military strategy, Museveni and Obote were unable to find common ground. Museveni was inspired by his disagreement to create the Front for National Salvation, known more commonly as FRNASA. Many Banyarwanda gravitated towards FRNASA through a desire to oppose Amin's regime. Among these Banyarwanda was Fred Rwigema, a Rwandan Tutsi refugee who joined FRNASA in 1976. FRNASA aided in the overthrow of Amin in 1979, but when the President Nyerere backed Obote, won the presidential election of 1980, the members of FRNASA were placed in danger. Obote and his administration identified members of FRNASA as a threat largely due to their origin from southern and western Uganda. Obote's disdain for Rwandan descendants and refugees was evident in his development of the Uganda National Liberation Army, also known as the UNLA, after the fall of Idi Amin. Quote, FRNASA forces, which by then numbered about 9,000, were ordered to report for retraining. On arrival, only 4,000 were accepted, the remainder being disqualified on the grounds that they were Rwandan. Fred Rwigema, end quote. Fred Rwigema was among these Rwandan descendants to be tried for demobilization. The accepted FRNASA units trained with Obote's Kikosi Maalum Special Battalion for the UNLA. The remaining FRNASA soldiers were assigned to UNLA units in districts in the north of Uganda, dispersed and far from their origins, whereas loyal troops were stationed in and around Kampala. With the results of a suspected rigged election, as Museveni says in The Sowing of the Mustard Seed, Obote gained control of the presidency for a second time. Due to the ideological differences and a dislike towards Obote's oppression of the people of the West and South, Museveni pressed on in his desire for a people's war. He created the National Resistance Army with the aid of Professor Lula of Nairobi in 1981. Many Banyarwanda gravitated towards Museveni due to his background. He was born in the Ntungamo district of southwestern Uganda to a family of cattle ranchers. Museveni came from the Hima ethnic group, closely related to the Tutsi, and he sympathized with the Rwandan exiles from his home region. Thus, many of his supporters are from southwestern Uganda and share the common disdain for Obote's oppression. The Rwandan Tutsi were very influential in the NRA, both in their numbers and in the significant roles which they held. In response to Museveni's advances against Obote's government, propaganda forces of the UNLA aimed to rally popular feelings against Museveni, using anti-foreign and anti-Banyarwanda sentiment. In 1982, President Obote made seditious speeches against the Banyarwanda, claiming they had helped him in and were now backing Museveni. The government-owned Uganda Times claimed, quote, "Most atrocities during Amin's era were committed by refugees. Refugees have been found to flirt with terrorists in Luwero district and are responsible for the unrest there. If refugees, particularly those from Rwanda, do not reciprocate our hospitality, we shall tell them to go," end quote. Obote's forces tried to discredit Museveni by claiming he was Rwandan. UPC supporters often attacked Rwandan Tutsi refugees whom were incapable of fleeing to Rwanda due to the Tutsi genocide, which left them with the opportunity to join the NRA. And by 1986, 1/4 of the National Resistance Army forces were Rwandan. A leading member of the NRA, when asked about recruitment, said, "The main recruiting officer for the NRA was Obote himself." While the number of Rwandans in the NRA shows the significant role they played in the overthrow of Obote, the true significance is reflected in the highly important positions held by Rwandans, Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema. Kagame grew up in exile in Uganda due to his Tutsi heritage and the violence his family faced from the Hutu in 1959. Kagame studied at Makerere University in Kampala and went on to become Yoweri Museveni's chief of intelligence in opposition of Milton Obote in 1986. Kagame never received significant recognition like the many celebrated NRA fighters, but he was essential in his military intelligence role. Eventually, he was Museveni's most trusted intelligence agent. After the NRA gained control of Uganda, Kagame was appointed the Deputy Director of Military Intelligence. Kagame's achievements in the intelligence field are representative of Museveni's trust towards the Rwandan Tutsi. Like Kagame, Fred Rwigema was a Rwandan refugee who fled with his family to Ankole following the Hutu revolts of 1959. Rwigema joined Frelimo in 1976 and fought for Mozambique's independence from Portugal with Frelimo. He was one of Museveni's biggest supporters and rose quickly through the ranks in the NRA. He was a deputy commander of the 1st Mobile Force and in just a few years' time was the Western Axis commander. Looking back on the role of the Rwandans around the time of victory in 1986, Museveni said, "Although there was some chauvinist sentiments lingering about, this time my Pan-Africanist ideas gained the upper hand because I was in control. The refugee Banyarwanda fighters were this time fully integrated into the NRA. Fred Rwigema becoming a major general when we introduced ranks in January 1988. Fred Rwigema kept telling me about their homeland Rwanda, from which they were excluded by the sectarian regime that was in charge." End quote. Museveni envisioned a brighter future for Rwanda through the potential he saw in both Rwigema and Kagame. He recommended the former for the Senior Command and Staff Course in the United States, but Rwigema passed it on to Kagame. In conclusion, the role the Rwandan Tutsi played in the National Resistance Army was essential to the success of Yoweri Museveni. The ethnic divide between the Hutu and Tutsi created by the Belgians in Rwanda was the driving force for the Tutsi diaspora to Uganda. The oppression that the Banyarwanda faced from the regimes of Obote and Amin inspired their enlistment in the NRA to support Museveni in the overthrow of Obote. The significance of the roles filled by Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema signify the trust Museveni had with the Banyarwanda and the significance of the Rwandan Tutsi in the National Resistance Army. This concludes my presentation. I plan to further research the development of the Rwandan Patriotic Front by Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema and their invasion into Rwanda in 1990. I haven't gotten to that point in my research, but if you have any recommendations, I would really appreciate them. Thank you very much.
I spent some time doing research in Rwanda as a guest of the Rwandan Defense Force in July and August of 2012. It was a really fascinating time, great research experience, although I recognize that there was some bias entered into it by the fact that we were showed around by RDF officers the whole time we were there. And so today I'm going to present a couple of things that I learned there in terms of how the Rwandans managed their diaspora. Before I get started, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback. And also to thank Professor Thomas, who ordered me to write this paper and to be here. West Point is going to miss him. And a final disclaimer, I do not speak for anybody but myself, not the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, the Military Academy, or even the West Point Golf Club. So Rwandan governments have a long history of trouble with Rwandans living abroad. Immediately prior to gaining independence in 1961, Rwanda, of course, experienced a social revolution in which the Hutu masses gained political power at the expense of the traditional Tutsi elite, and the Tutsi left for neighboring countries in droves, as Emma's been discussing very helpfully. For the next 3 decades, most of those that left intermittently and ineffectively worked to return to their homeland while attaining positions of power in neighboring countries. This was especially true in Uganda, where Rwandan Tutsi military men play an important role in Yoweri Museveni's long-arm struggle against the government. After helping Museveni attain the Ugandan presidency in 1986, these Tutsi felt increasingly alienated from their adopted homeland, and in 1988 they formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, in Kampala to organize an armed return to their homeland. In 1990, they invaded Rwanda, sparking the civil war that culminated in the 1994 genocide and the subsequent RPF conquest of the country. Although nominally part of a coalition unity government for much of the 1990s, the RPF, under the increasingly strong leadership of Paul Kagame, has effectively controlled the country ever since. Given Rwanda's recent history, it is unsurprising that the RPF remains profoundly concerned with managing Rwandans living abroad. When they first took power, Rwanda had a higher percentage of its population living in exile than any other country in Africa, at the time mostly in the Congo. This claim remains true today, with nearly 5 million Rwandans, according to the Rwandan government, living in other states around the world, although today they are, of course, much less concentrated in the Congo. The RPF recognizes that those abroad can be both a potent threat and a valuable source of support. National identity is both utilitarian and ideational. In Rwanda, both are important. Elite Rwandans frequently claim that they are distinguished from neighboring states by their distinctive national identity. The continuity of Rwandan state institutions centered on the Kuwa-Anda military training system, the distinctive Rwandan national character, which is so striking to visitors, and the intensity over fights regarding ethnicity in relation to Rwandan national identity, of these fights including, of course, both the genocide and attempts by the RPF to erase the concept of ethnicity in Rwanda itself since 1994, all suggest that there is both historical truth and political utility to be found in these claims. Those who flee Rwanda remain members of the supposed Rwandan nations, and thus the Rwandan state must remain responsible for them so long as they seek to be the Rwandan nation state as they claim. Rwanda is a very small country, and its commensurately small political elite is very good at staying on message. The official line about Rwandan refugees is a uniformly positive one. Rwandan political officials emphasize the fundamental role of the Rwandan diaspora vis-a-vis the Rwandan homeland as economic. They hope that the diaspora will provide direct economic support to Rwanda, attain educational skills that will prove useful if they return, and help enhance Rwanda's international reputation, which, as Rwandans are profoundly aware, is valuable in securing foreign development aid. The Diaspora General Directorate, or DGD, maintains a website to applaud those who take up those roles, and Rwandan embassies abroad do the same. Some of the specific efforts of the DGD have been helpfully chronicled by Simon Turner. The positive view of the diaspora stems from a focus on one specific part of the diaspora as a whole. The Rwandan state has worked to erase the ethnic categorizations of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, but they have replaced them with new categories of all sorts. Rwandans remain profoundly concerned with who is a survivor of the genocide and who might be a genocidaire. The nature of these categories continues to perplex foreign observers, and the methods the regime and the Rwandan state use for categorizing various Rwandans living abroad are similarly confusing. David Newbury, to provide some historical context, has identified 4 major categories of people who have been geographically dislocated from quote-unquote Rwanda during its history. First, there are those people who fled the wars of pre-colonial dynastic expansion. He writes, their move was permanent, and thus they represent the people of Rwandan culture, people of Rwandan culture who were later omitted from the colonial definition of Rwanda. Second, there are colonial labor immigrants who won't play a large role in this paper. Third, there are those who fled Rwanda during the turbulent decolonization period, including most of those who later formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And fourth, there are those who fled during and after the 1994 genocide, including the large groups of Hutus who continue to fight, to some extent, although less effectively, a guerrilla campaign against the RPF from the Congo. Simon Turner, meanwhile, argues that the Rwandan diaspora is categorized by the state today into 3 categories. First, and I quote, a positive diaspora that supports the state. Second, a skeptical diaspora whose members may be converted. And finally, a hostile diaspora, which is beyond reach. Turner also claims that Rwandan officials have divided the population among 4 official categories, including survivors, those Tutsi who lived through the genocide, old caseload returnees, those Tutsi who fled after 1959, new caseload returnees, the Hutu who fled after 1994, and suspected genocidaires. Turner, I think, exaggerates the role of ethnicity in shaping these categories. From what I've learned, ethnicity is actually in secondary importance in distinguishing new and old caseload returnees especially. And in fact, the key difference between them, in the eyes of the RPF, is the different political motivations that shaped their flight. So for example, economically empowered Hutu who fled in 1959 to 64 fit comfortably into the old caseload group, but generally he gets the titles for the categories right. Today, I would like to propose a different categorization based on my work and highlight some of the hitherto unstudied Rwandan efforts to reach out to some of the groups identified. I will argue that the Rwandan government focuses the overwhelming majority of its attention on 3 distinctive groups of Rwandans abroad. First, there are the potentially economically supportive returnees living in the West and some other African states. Second, there are new caseload returnees and potential returnees, many of whom remain in the Congo. And third, there are political refugees seeking to avoid the RPF. Turner's work focuses almost entirely on the first group, and he provides a useful and interesting account of how interaction with the diaspora has been integrated into Rwanda's broader economic planning. He argues that, and I quote again, the Rwandan state performs in relation to the diaspora in order to remove the political and security threat of the hostile diaspora and create a supportive developmental diaspora. This is, and again I quote, part of a larger state-making process where the Rwandan state stages itself as the moral defender of development, progress, and unity, end quote. Turner, however, exaggerates the performative and underrates the biopolitical means of the current RPF regime. While Turner suggests that he was writing about the Rwandan diaspora, he is really writing about Rwandan state interactions with a subset of the broader group of Rwandans living abroad, which is always referred to as the diaspora, capitalized. I'm henceforth going to call them the first group of diaspora to emphasize the capitalization for the sake of oral presentation. The DGD, his focus was, and I quote again, established by the government after realizing its diaspora potential and the role that they can play in Rwandan developmental process and its view to involve its nationals around the world in national development, according to its own website. By focusing on that organization and its performative work, Turner misses some of the other ways that the Rwandan state reaches out to Rwandan abroad. Even the members of the first group diaspora are being integrated into the control mechanisms of the state, a trend which scholars, including Turner, have thus far ignored. And I hate scrolling sometimes. One of the main means the RPF uses to mobilize its population in support of its developmental goals is Ngando, a sort of summer camps at which Rwandans listen to nationalistic speeches and engage in team-building activities. It's easy to paint Ngando as a form of military training, and some excellent research by Andrea Pertikova has talked about this extensively. If you're interested in the program more generally, I'll direct you to her research. Essentially, though, I'd just like to say Ngando has been labeled as a homegrown solution by the Rwandans. I've had an opportunity to visit some of the camps, and they aren't terribly militaristic, although the military has a large role in running them. It's sort of like a nationalistic summer camp, very similar to like the Boy Scouts or Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps here in the United States. What Turner and Pertikova do not note in their research is that the Rwandan government has developed a special form of Ngando specifically for members of the first group diaspora. Many of the population has participated in Ngando at least once since 1994, and it has become a rite of passage into the Rwandan nation for youth, prisoners, and new caseload returnees. The Rwandan elite even participated in a form of Ngando led by President Kagame, which is an annual sort of reflective exercise. The first group diaspora youth are another population deemed important enough to have their own Ngando, which of course indicates that the Rwandan state wants to incorporate them into the Rwandan nation, and theirs has certain unique characteristics. It even has its own name. The word Ngando is derived from the Kinyarwanda word kugandika, which refers to halting reflection. But the first group diaspora Ngando takes the same form basically as other Ngandos, but takes the title Itorero, which is Kinyarwanda for education. I wish I could say something insightful about the title difference, but I couldn't come up with anything. Itorero, like Ngando, is a product of the Rwandan Interagency. It's jointly organized, like Ngando, by the ministries of Ngando, Defense, National Unity and Reconciliation, and Education, as well as, unlike Ngando, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Since 2009, this last ministry has brought a group of several hundred first group diaspora youths back to Rwanda each summer, all of them under the age of 24 by statute requirement. And while in Rwanda, these young people, many of whom have never been to Rwanda before, participate in a roughly 3-week program consisting of lectures in English, again by both RDF officers and business leaders, and military training of all sorts. I want to be very clear that this military training is more nationalistic than useful for military purposes. A large part of it is traditional dancing and singing, which was great military training in the 19th century, but not so useful today. And it seems that the youth involved are far more concerned with hanging out with each other than with the fact that they get to fire weapons once, much to the amusement of their military cadre during the course of the training. The Itorero program, however, has much more military support than the general Uganda one, but this does not seem to reflect any desire to militarize the first group diaspora vice the Rwandan population. Instead, an RDF officer told me that it simply reflects the regime focus on Itorero and the fact that the regime would like to see as much RDF participation as possible in all of these events because the RDF is seen as the guardian of the nation's spirit. I actually had the pleasure of dining in the senior officers' mess in Kigali with some of these students in August 2012 while I was in Rwanda doing research. The meeting was not arranged. I just happened to hear a bunch of Americans chatting in the mess, and so leaned over and started talking with them. I can't speak definitely about all first group diaspora perceptions of the program, but it's worth noting that the students that I talked to were clearly enjoying the program. They recognized the propagandizing was a little bit heavy-handed, but found it sort of amusing, and were much more concerned with the camaraderie building going on with the trip. The students I talked to actually included 2 American-born girls of high school age who were, of course, of Rwandan origins, and they had never visited the country before this training camp, which was a very interesting experience for them. Their minder, who was not with us for most of the conversations, later proudly told me that rather like the birthright trips that American Jews often take back to Israel, a large number of marriages occur among couples who meet at Itorero. So now I'd like to turn our gaze to the second group which receives attention to the regime, new caseload returnees and potential returnees. Turner suggested that are a part actually of the hostile diaspora, but the actions of the Rwandan state suggest otherwise. The Rwandan state maintains that all Rwandans living abroad remain part of the Rwandan nation. Rwanda receives substantial international support for the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration (DDR) process, which is aimed at militia groups in the Congo. It is in the interest of the Rwandan state to ensure that they are well integrated into the Rwandan polity, and continuing international support has been essential to allowing this program to continue for 2 decades. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission broadcast radio messages to groups in the Congo beseeching them to return home, and a series of reintegration centers near the Congolese border re-educate former militants. Thank you. If and when they do return home, and then sets them up for economic success as small farmers. And of course, they also participate in Ngando. And it's worth noting that the Ngando scheme itself was originally developed in the late 1990s as a way to benefit ex-combatants who had fought the regime as part of the Hutu militias in neighboring countries. International organizations argue that their support for the Rwandan DDR process is a humanitarian venture. It is important that we remember that they are also helping to build the Rwandan nation state, even if they do not intend to. The RPF wants to build a nation state, and by reaching out to members of their nation outside of their state boundaries, they solidify their dominance as the state over the Rwandan nation. The DDR process also plays an important role in Rwanda's policy towards Congo, which has so far gone unreported. The DDR process reintegrates many former Hutu militants associated with the anti-RPF former FDLR groups, but in recent years it has also come to reintegrate an increasing number of members of M23 and other anti-Congolese government groups. Many today claim that the RPF actively supports M23. I really believe that this hasn't been proved conclusively. The best attempt was a 2012 report by the UN group of experts, but it was widely disparaged for the anti-RPF bias of its authors, and also the fact that it didn't present any evidence besides a couple of Rwandan identity cards they'd found in Congo and hearsay. But let's assume for a moment, and I don't think that's a terrible controversial assumption, that the Rwandans are supporting M23. And if that's the case, they've effectively convinced the international community to set up a retirement program for their former militants in the Congo. Which is hidden within the DDR process and which gives those soldiers too old to continue to serve in M23 a very nice landing package when they return home. This further ensures that instability in the Congo is unlikely to be brought into Rwanda by returning militants. Statistics shared with the author by Rwandan officials working at the Matobo reintegration camp demonstrate that M23 returnees are much likely to be older and wounded than former Hutu militants, and suggest that the Rwandans very carefully manage this program. The final group which the Rwandan regime maintains concern with are political exiles. I encourage anyone interested in this topic to read The Rwandan, which is an online magazine published by Exiles, and those interested in spy stories to read Foreign Policy's April 1st articles on the RPF's alleged efforts to assassinate exiled dissidents. Otherwise, all that can be said definitely and usefully right now is that the actual group of political outcasts from the Rwandan nations is very small, and increasingly and very interestingly consists of defectors from the RPF regime itself rather than the unity government of the 1990s. These few individuals remain the concern of the National Security Service and probably have no relationship to the other organizations of the Rwandan state. The picture that emerges from this brief account of the Rwandan state and the Rwandan diaspora is exactly what we should expect to see in a country which considers itself a burgeoning nation state. The Rwandan diaspora is not the concern of a single Rwandan institution, but of the entire Rwandan state entity. This is a nation-state's imperative, and it is a pattern which previous research by Turner and others has not revealed. Past research on the Rwandan state and its diaspora sometimes fit neatly into the narrative of a Rwandan theater state, which suggests that Rwandans are trained through performative imitation in Uganda and other institutions to be performers in a state which then performs to foreigners to gain aid. Even Pertikova's excellent research often emphasizes this narrative. There are clearly more important issues for students of the fascinating Rwandan state to address. Foreign historians, for example, have completely ignored the developing nationalist historiography in Rwanda, a program of museum construction and book writing organized by Major General Frank Kagera. The RPF's past, including their past with refugees, shapes their current perspective, but we still cannot say what lessons they have learned. Conversely, dissident voices have also largely been ignored in past studies of Rwanda. Finally, the tendency to focus on single institutions, such as just the DGD, rather than coordinated interagency efforts of the Rwandan state, has sometimes caused researchers to underrate the much more important interagency and collaborative efforts. We should pay less attention to display and more attention to the state which is capable of carrying out to the display. After all, our job is to peek behind the curtains. Thank you very much.
I'm going to make my intervention to the three of you. And I'm doing this because maybe I come from the continent you are talking about, and I've visited all the countries you're talking about, and I've participated in some of the issues you are discussing. For Idi Amin, I don't know, but your own presentation is the narrative, official narrative we always hear. Yeah. But go beyond a little bit of his level of education, his own background, how he grew up into the level that he got into the army without practically no education beyond secondary school, and the favors he received, the presidents he served, whom he eventually overthrew, and his relationship with the Middle East, and eventually the bad governance that took place there. There could be the most substantive reasons, not necessarily what the Exiles and Gerard Nyerere did. Then when we come back to the Rwanda issue, if you look at that Great Lake States, Rwanda, Burundi, which is now Burundi, you have the Congo and even Uganda. All of them have a common language, the Swahili language. But if you find out again, you find out that these Tutsi are in Rwanda, they are in Burundi, they are in Congo, they are in Uganda, southern Uganda. They are there. Now, they claim that whether was Yoweri is a Ugandan or a Tutsi, that man, the president of Uganda now, is a Tutsi. You need to find out that. That is why his army commander, who is Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, was his army commander and advisor, military advisor, which you have acknowledged. And the two of them are president, Tutsi. And the two of them have refused to hold democratic elections to either go or allow somebody come in. And they are extending their tenures. It's a deliberate institutionalization of the Tutsi. By the time Kagame leaves, some of us in Africa are getting afraid. We may have another uprising because he is not allowed the space which he thought the Hutus had not allowed to take place in that area. So your research may go a little bit beyond that, because in Africa, we don't have the problem of color. We have the problem of tribe and religion, ethnicity. And within that region, just like you mentioned, it is ethnicity, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and the oppression of one group over the other that took place during colonialism, aided by the Belgians. And the issue of the cow, like she mentioned, very, very important. But who had the cow? It was the Tutsi that had the cow. The Hutu took it over and became rich because of that. And they had to go for education to be able to survive in that area. So when you have this narrative, you need to go a little bit better. And I don't know whether you visited the genocide memorial in Rwanda, in Kigali. If you visited the genocide, you will go through the history and you begin to see what the Belgians colonialists did. And that was the seed of what is happening within that great region. So we are looking at it beyond this common narrative because we are afraid of what may happen after Kagame leaves. He's doing a good job. The Mgando, it's a good thing. But again, look beyond that. Why is it that it is the Tutsi returnees that are being trained paramilitary in the Mgando problem? Is it to perpetuate the military and the dominance of the Tutsi when Kagame leaves? These are questions that some of us scholars in Africa are asking because it could portend danger for us. For a country that has come out of such a terrible genocide, is doing so very well, but there's no preparation for transitions, and we may revert back to chaos. That is my own intervention. Thank you very much. I just came back from the 3 countries in November last year.
So who wants to start on our panel addressing?
Unless you want to, Professor, you have ranks.
I think it's the only time I ever will, so I'll take it.
Actually, how come my students never said that?
You didn't make them wear uniforms. At least I completely agree with you on getting deeper into Idi Amin. I couldn't so much in this paper simply because I was focusing with the themes of the conference, but certainly the militarization of ethnicity, the fast-paced Africanization of the military in the late colonial era, where you have Idi Amin, who is roughly literate, who is very grade school level education, who is really, when you read the British files on him, they're more excited that he's a champion boxer and rugby player than they are that he is a good officer. And beyond that, the files look as if they the other thing they're praising is his readiness to actually use brutality against the land and freedom armies in Kenya. Beyond that, it's kind of strange whenever you look at, whether you're looking at Mobutu Sese Seko or an Idi Amin or the like, of how the initial years of their rule, they're very, very popular. People at first think they're the solution. And so actually, strangely, this is, at least for me, part of the reason I'm positive that the 1972 invasion actually doesn't work, aside from it's very badly planned. But it's also that there's still quite a bit of support for the Amin regime. And there is no chance for a popular uprising, even in the Ankole district where Museveni says he will have massive support. But I mean, it's the exile of the Asian immigrant community that Amin calls as economic warfare that completely undermines the economy of the country. That begins kind of a spiral. By the end of his regime, they're actually smuggling more coffee out of the country than they're selling. In fact, I believe it's Tanzania actually in 1977 sells something like 80,000 pounds of Robusto coffee, which is funny because Tanzania doesn't grow Robusto coffee. And so it isn't until, and so yes, I mean, there's dozens of factors why in 78, 79 Amin's regime topples. It's not just Tanzania. It's not just the Uganda National Liberation Front, the Exiles, but at least this is the small piece of the narrative I was putting out at the moment. But thank you.
You discussed the importance of the cow, and you're absolutely right. I discussed that the Belgians classified the ethnic groups based on the number of cattle that each farmer had, whether they were Hutu or Tutsi, which takes away from that ethnicity factor. And then another important factor, I think, is in Museveni's autobiography, he actually discusses for multiple pages the importance of cows in his life growing up, which I think is fascinating. He talks about how they had a name for every single cow based on their descriptions, their characteristics. They knew which mothers were the mothers of certain cows, how growing up at 3 years old he was already learning how to graze his cattle, and how important and central it was to his ethnic group, his ethnicity, and his life. So thank you for bringing up that point. We're hooked.
So I just wanted to comment on two things. First of all, in terms of the democratic transition to Rwanda, I think that we all pray that that will go well. And unfortunately, I don't feel like I can comment on a whole lot more than that, just because I recognized a lot of its internal elite politics that we won't be able to understand for 20 years, if then. But I did want to say briefly on commenting on the fact that there are Tutsis living all around the Great Lakes region. It's interesting to see as the Rwandan state decides that they want to be a nation state, and that assumedly some element of Rwandanness has to be a part of that. Will the Rwandan state continue to reach out to Tutsi and nearby regions as aggressively as they have? Because the Rwandan state also historically did not reach out that much to Tutsi and neighboring nations, and the Rwandan state found it politically convenient and also, I think, necessary for humanitarian reasons, because I do think that there were some very good Pan-Africanist motivations behind the invasion of the Congo in the 1990s, just because some of the Tutsi in neighboring countries became stateless. So I don't know what the Rwandans are going to do in relation to Tutsi populations in nearby countries in the future years, but you would imagine, again, as Rwanda becomes more of a nation state, they can no longer justify their Tutsi elite reaching out to the Tutsi elite or just people who self-identify as Tutsi in nearby countries. Interesting to think about in the future. I said absolutely nothing conclusive, so next question, I guess.
It's a very brief question. You had mentioned, I just had written down, are these refugee camps modeled on Israeli diaspora programs? And you just mentioned it. Has there been a self-conscious modeling on these, on these youth programs, or is Israel involved in this in any way? Because they have, of course, there's a deeper history of Israeli involvement in Uganda.
Right.
I mean, not that they're, like everybody else, they're messing around in other parts of the world too. But is this something that they did self-consciously, or has this just evolved and are these comparable in the way they look?
So I've never seen a Rwandan reference the birthright program in reference to Itorero, except for American Rwandans, who of course naturally see the parallels to their American Jewish friends. So I don't know if it's self-consciously imitated. It's definitely a topic for further research. I do know there is a large amount of aid money that comes in from Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans to support Rwanda, and that's been true since the genocide, because of course they see the parallel experience. And so I imagine there has been some translation of ideas. Unfortunately, I can't point to it exactly. And the other thing about the aid money is that it's often very, very hard to figure out exactly what aid money is going to who. And so I haven't been able to prove, or even find conclusively, I guess I should say, any evidence that there is specifically like Jewish American aid money or Jewish aid money that goes into support Itorero, although I know that it is supported by foreign donors of some sort.
The only thing that I might add is as you were, because I know I read this last night, but I'm certain I just blew past it to a degree, is the other example that they may be looking at is from the 1963 to the 1990s, Tanzania actually has their national service, which parallels almost exactly what they're doing here. And of course, they self-consciously say this is like the kibbutz the whole time. This is, you're going to work for your country, you're going to do small-scale agriculture, things like that. So it may be one degree of separation or directly, or maybe none at all, but I like speculating.
And Museveni would have seen that as a student at Dar es Salaam.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If I might say definitely too, I did actually ask a bunch of people if they saw the Israeli parallel. I was in Rwanda, and nobody mentioned it, so yeah.
I've got a question in the back, and then I'll come back to the front.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'm very much interested to know the role that Kenya played during that period, because your focus was more on Tanzania, but the coup and the political turmoil in Uganda began taking place when Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania were trying to forge a union. Yeah. So, but then in your presentation, you mentioned nothing about Kenya. You focused more on Tanzania's role in Uganda. Is it a question of ideology, or what was the reason why Kenya was not involved? So, I wish just to know about the omission of Kenya, but also perhaps explore more about a question of ideology, because it appears Obote and Nyerere were somehow socialists. So, but anyway, I don't want to preempt that. I would just wish you to explain the omission of Kenya. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. I'll start speaking loudly just as I like jumping right in. I omitted Kenya for a few reasons. One, I haven't finished my archival research there, and so I didn't want to speak authoritatively. The other side of it is you struck on ideology, and this is actually very important. Kenya does not like Obote, and when Obote is thrown from power, they're actually fairly supportive of the Amin regime. And then when Amin actually needs to export goods, he's exporting them out of Kenya, and they're making quite a lot of money out of it. And so what ends up actually happening is they're very, I wouldn't say they're supportive of Amin's actions within Uganda, but they don't want to rock the boat. And so the exile groups that actually try forming in Kenya and the exiles that actually begin getting active in Kenya actually in many cases get arrested and deported to Uganda, to Amin, or are picked up by police and just held in detention. To a degree, Kenya actively suppresses exile activity. They don't mind them being there, but they refuse to have anything to do with any anti-Amin activity. In fact, the only time there's a split between Amin and Kenya to a degree in terms of state-state relations, I'm certain they didn't care for the man himself, is Amin refused to pay his bills. And he wouldn't pay the transit bills through Kenya, and they eventually stopped importing oil to him, and he had to pay up very quickly because his country had, a worse economic crisis. By the time his regime is over, Kenya still is very passive in terms of anti-Amin activity, but they're not letting him export anything. In fact, at that point, he's airlifting a good chunk of the little remaining legitimate coffee he's able to sell to Djibouti and selling it out of there. But at least part of the reason Kenya had been tertiary for me is to a degree I don't think it ever really countenanced Amin, but it certainly was not anti-Amin, and in many cases prevented kind of greater anti-Amin movements. So I think, yeah. All right, well, thank you.
After years of this, I still have to figure out how to put these on. Okay. Am I good?
Yes,
Okay.
you are.
Alrighty. For the greater panel, and I think in particular for Mr. Allen, let me just say that you did great presentations, and thank you so much for sharing with us. Peeping behind the curtains a little bit, as you said, I am going to venture to ask, or maybe to make a comment and to ask a question on some of the research one of your research scholars had brought up. And the question was, what is their concern? What is the RPF concern about exiles from Rwanda or Rwandese living in exile? And I often like to not use Hutus or Tutsis to refer to Rwandans anymore, because that's not the way they refer to themselves. But I know for the purpose of your presentations, we've used it to make distinctions. However, my concern when this question is asked by the scholar of your research is, why wouldn't the FPR be concerned about Rwandese living outside in exile and wanting them to come in? President Kagame has long been under pressure to round up Rwandan citizens all over the world, including the Great Lakes region, and make sure they come back home. And he himself has put out national information saying that he does not, or the government of Rwanda does not consider Rwandans refugees anymore, and the country is open for all Rwandese to come back in and to help to be able to grow the country. And I believe that it's only by doing this and including all Rwandese that they're going to be able to feel like it's necessary for them to be back in their countries and helping to grow the countries. So that's a comment that I wanted to make in reference to that. Secondly, the Uganda training camps, as people refer to it in most places around the world, and as you clarified, is information as well as nationalistic training. And I know that President Kagame has gotten a lot of flack from a lot of world leaders and also from a lot of people who have just not done a lot of background research on these camps. And these camps are not generally military training camps, but informational camps. These types of organization and camps go on all around the world where there are military presence or military training. And certainly if we remember, I think it might have been somewhere in one of the Norwegian countries where this type of nationalistic training was going on and so many young people were killed. So this is not anything that I think the world must fear, that President Kagame is training Hutus. As a matter of fact, this camp involves Hutus and Tutsis, you know, for lack of use, I mean, for distinctions in terms of lack of using Rwandese themselves. So both of them are involved in this camp. My larger concern of Rwanda is that the Batwas are not generally included in the greater discussion of Rwanda. And so that's more of a concern to me than Rwanda moving forward, because I really do trust that under President Kagame's regime, under any regime that's to come, that he would, and certainly would still have a voice in, that Rwanda is going to be a country that's moving forward. I think they've made great strides, and I think they're going to continue to make great strides. I often wonder, and I'm going to address my colleague here, I often wonder as well what Rwanda would look like if Fred had also reached at the level where President Kagame is. But we have to realize he didn't, and the country is still moving. And I strongly believe that Rwanda is a country that we're going to continue to see great things from in the Great Lakes region.
If I may take this one.
Hold on.
Yeah, I'll wait for the mic.
Thank you.
So a lot in there, all of which was really interesting. I think I may have overrated the RPF's fear of their own refugees in sort of the introduction of my paper, because that's sort of like the default thing to say, right? Like, they were refugees, so naturally they're afraid that like some new refugee army is going to be formed. Like, where, right? If it were forming in the Congo, they could definitely reach out and touch it at this point. And I probably could have seen that had I really sat and thought a little bit more about my own paper too, just because it is true. I do think that the group of actual outcasts from the Rwandan nations, because I do think that the political exiles still, Kagame doesn't want to have anything to do with. If he's not assassinating them, the fact that people plausibly believe that he has a campaign of assassination against them says something about his general political approach to them. But generally, I think you're right. And there's not really a lot of fear that there'll be an opposition that forms against him in exile. And so I should reconsider that in my introductory paragraph. I think you're absolutely right about Ngando. I never got to visit actual Ngando, just at Torero, but I got to speak to lots of people who participated in it. And it really did sort of remind me of my experience in the Boy Scouts. Also, to underscore that, I talked to a lot of Rwandan army officers about Ngando who get to participate in them. And they just like make fun of the military training, because they recognize that it has no utility whatsoever. I can say absolutely nothing about the Twa, which is embarrassing but true. So you've given me a new research direction to go in. Just out of curiosity, if I might ask you a brief question, is it more acceptable to discuss Twa ethnicity in Rwanda? Because I never met a Hutu or a Tutsi while I was there. They're just all Rwandans. But do people still self-identify as Twa much?
I don't think Rwandans self-identify as any of the ethnic groups.
Right. Okay.
Because the Batwas are marginalized in some ways still, I think people tend to single them out in some ways, just as a marker. However, no, not in the general scheme of things, it's Rwanda.
Yeah. And if I might say one last thing, because you mentioned Major General Fred, or Gisa as all the Rwandans call him. One of the things that is really remarkable to me and makes me really hopeful about the way that Kagame has set up the Rwandan state is that Gisa is still such a huge source of inspiration to all RDF officers. In fact, far more than Kagame himself, right? Kagame is a hero, but like Gisa's the guy. And you've seen some dissidents try to utilize this. I mean, the general in exile in South Africa claims, totally implausibly, that Kagame had Gisa killed. It's interesting too, it seems like the public memorialization of Gisa is going up. I know they're building, General Rusagara is organizing the construction of the new National Liberation War Monument in Kigali, which I guess is open by now, right? Because it was supposed to be open for the 20th anniversary. Okay. Well, next time in Rwanda, I'll have to go visit it. I saw the plans and I was really excited for it. And so the fact that Rwandans have these national heroes that have nothing to do with the current regime, and also will continue to provide sort of a stable model for like nationalist virtue, I think is one of the things that is going to sustain them into the post-Kagame future. He's one of those truly heroic figures, and yeah, it's just such a tragedy that he was lost so early on. But anybody else?
Well, we're getting towards the end, and my prerogative as a chair is to use a little bit of the time. I want to try to bring a few things together. I think what is really important, between the three papers, of course, is the fact that no matter which part of Africa you want to learn the history, and of course we're in the Great Lakes and looking at what seemed to be Uganda or Rwanda, but really we're looking at the region. You cannot, if you're going to learn history, you've got to cross borders, right? Because people have crossed those borders, and certainly talking about the diaspora. It was striking to me. I've just spent many months in East Africa, was in Kenya, and the younger generation was in Kenya right before the elections last year, and how many of the young Kenyans were telling me that one of the countries they want to go visit is Rwanda, because they're seeing something different. They're interested in understanding, how do you value education? How do you change certain things around? The other thing that is very important as a marker, and it was actually great that you mentioned it, is the fact that yes, a lot of their training is not militarized. If you look at Mugabe, the youth camps are preparing for something much more sinister than a national identity. And so I think it's really incredible to see the way that Rwanda has changed over time. Of course, today is the 20th anniversary of the shooting down of a plane and, with a French Scud missile, part of my identity not so proud about. And so it's certainly very important to realize what they've done in 20 years. And I must say, for those of us that are worried, because transition to democracy is not easy. If you look at the United States, it took 100 years to finally have a civil war, to finally somewhat resolve some of the issues of different ethnicities, right? And then in the 60s, we were again at it. So, certainly Europe has had their very problematic democratic transitions. There's no reason why other countries in the world should be doing it much faster than anywhere else. But what's amazed me when I was in Rwanda is the access that I had. So I went to interview General James Kabarebe, who is the Minister of Defense, and he's been one of the prominent persons who has been in charge of bringing together the military. And, you were bringing French, poorly trained by the French, I should say, Rwandan army, with very well trained by the British in Uganda, RPF troops, right? And so the languages, the different concepts, the different reasons for their training, and their different achievements, right? But they've been able to do it over time. You've got to realize, and so even with a concern that if we could still trace Tutsi, and those of us who have done this work for a very long time, usually wherever a group has been exiled, okay, if they tell you that they grew up in Tanzania, they're probably this. If they told you that they grew up in Uganda, they're probably this. If they grew up in this area of Goma, they're probably that. But the reality is most of us, in respect for, the changes in the country, don't speak about anything but, Rwandans, right? For those of you who are going to be still here in Texas or in the United States, SP, do you want to tell us a little bit about the event that is taking place on the 19th? And I think that's important because the Rwandans are very active. Rwanda Day happens every year now, and there are many, many organizations that are putting Rwandan groups together. Tell us a little bit about it, SP.
We have a memorial gathering on the 19th in Dallas. And our ambassador will be there, and Dr. Celine will be speaking too. So all of you are welcome to come, and it's going to be a very good event. Thank you.
in the government right now, Dr. Biruta, who is the Minister of Education, was also for 8 years the President of the Senate, is the President of the opposition party, the largest opposition party to the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And then when you go back, you need to talk to Aimable Bayingana, who is the head of the Diaspora for the Rwandan Patriotic Front. So there's, you know, and what's amazing is the amount of access that there is to the government. You know, we were taken to transition camps, so, you know, there's one of the most beautiful refugee camp I ever saw in Africa is actually very close to Lake Kivu, where they're bringing in anyone who wants to, you know, any Congolese who are leaving, not necessarily originally Rwandans. And then there's transition camps for fighters, people who want to lay down weapons. And again, they get retrained. And I was expecting a military camp because they told me it's a transition camp. It's, you know, it's a demilitarization camp. So I was expecting something that looked military. It's a village. The kids are running around, there is a hospital, there is water, there is a school, and when we arrived, you know, within minutes, with no cell phones, everyone showed up, and they didn't know we were stopping by. You know, I love the way that Africans can do this. And the country has really dramatically changed. One of the things that I was concerned with when I met with the general was asking, why do you still have so many military uniforms everywhere? Because to a lot of people outside, when you're in a country, it doesn't have to be in Africa, but if you're in a country and you see military uniforms and semi-automatic weapons on every corner street, it looks like, it feels like a military regime. And after several months, you know, in Rwanda, I started understanding, first of all, their military are not extremely armed. Usually you'll have 2 soldiers, probably only 1 as a weapon. And really, primarily, they're on the major crossing roads between Tanzania and Goma. Because indeed, there is a lot of transit of goods and a lot of transit of people. And at times, those are, you know, can be dangerous. But Rwanda now has free access to healthcare for everyone. And that's part of what their military does. The military-trained doctors go around and will provide. I mean, there's things that are just astonishing from what that country has been able to do. And it's really important to try to understand. And I can see, you know, especially some of you brought up the East African Union. The countries are really trying to get together and trying to learn from each other and trying to do it their own way. And I think that's something that's been very commendable about Rwanda, about some of the things that Kenya is doing, about some of the changes in Tanzania, and hopefully, you know, Uganda, which still can be very challenging, right? But there are some different, you know, different things happening in the Great Lakes, and so hopefully we'll see great changes in the next few conferences. Thank you.
Oh yeah, yeah.